Our principal speaker today is the director of the United States Program for Church World Service, the international disaster relief and development agency of over 30 United States Protestant and Orthodox denominations. Church World Services operates a network of 25 regional offices in the United States which carry on programs of education, fundraising, domestic disaster, and refugee resettlement. Included in Reverend Stenning's responsibilities is the administration of CROP, the Community Hunger Appeal of the Church World Service. CROP conducts educational events designed to increase public awareness of hunger. CROP also helps to raise funds which are used in over 70 different self-help development programs around the nation. Reverend Stenning is a native of Rhode Island. He's an ordained Episcopalian clergyman, is a graduate of Brown University and the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge. Prior to his ordination, Mr. Stenning spent several years in industry in the field of education and industrial relations. He has been active in a wide variety of programs on behalf of justice and human rights. He has participated in Peace Corps training seminars, served as an advisor to the Office of Economic Opportunity, and worked extensively in the civil rights movement. In Rhode Island, he has been a member of the Board of Directors of the Rhode Island State Council of Churches, a member of the Governor's Advisory Board on Social Welfare, a member of the Executive Council of the United Way, a member of the Providence Human Relations Commission, and a participant in many, many other activities too varied to mention now. In addition to his work as Director of Church World Service, Mr. Stenning has also served as the Director of the Church World Service Refugee Program. In that capacity, he has assisted refugees in Central America on the Honduras-El Salvador border. He has most recently returned from Poland, where he met with church and government officials to improve the climate for freedom and economic justice in that troubled nation. It is often said that the old-fashioned and simple virtues are no longer among us. Even this brief description of our speaker's career compels us to realize that virtues such as commitment, involvement, charity, and love of justice all reside firmly in Reverend Stenning. I'm very proud to present as our main speaker for this commencement ceremony the Reverend Ronald E. Stenning.
President Sweet, Dr. McMahon, distinguished guests, members of the graduating class, faculty, and friends. I'm very pleased to be with you today, not only to share in this happy occasion with this graduating class, but also because this is very much a homecoming for me to a state where my roots go very deep. As I thought about coming here, I was reminded of two other occasions when I was in this auditorium. And I mention them now not as personal reminiscences, but as public reminders of unfinished business that I think we must be about. The first was a memorial service held here almost 20 years ago for John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a man who in that time and for my generation was a symbol of hope, of new hope for peace, both for our own nation and for all the world. The second occasion I recall was a 3-day conference on religion and race in 1964. It had fallen to Rhode Island, the smallest state, and yet the cradle of religious liberty in this land, to be the first of all the states to gather together over 900 clergy, priests, ministers, rabbis, and lay representatives from all denominations to address the political, social, and moral dimensions of institutionalized and pervasive racism in our society. It was a major event in those tumultuous days. The media called it a corporate examination of conscience. And we searched for ways in which the benefits of life could be more equitably shared across the racial and economic lines which divide the people of this world. It is to those two pieces of unfinished business, the making of peace and bettering the quality of life for all people that I want to speak today. And I want to speak of the relationship between the two, for I feel that is a question we will face with persistent urgency in the years ahead. John Kennedy said in his inaugural address in January 1961 that the torch had been passed to a new generation of Americans, a generation born in this century, proud of its ancient heritage, and willing to pay any price to assure the survival and the success of liberty. The 2 decades since those words were spoken have not been easy ones, and my generation has not done very well. They have been difficult, uncertain, and anxious years. To paraphrase Charles Dickens, they have been the best of times and the worst of times. In a very real sense, they have brought us to a time of paradox, a time when we have learned to achieve most and to fear most. We seem to know more about war than about peace, more about outer space than inner being. Great advances in medicine and technology are overshadowed by unbelievable achievements in weapons of destruction. And it is a time today when the world fears not the primitive or ignorant person, but the educated, the technically competent, who have it in their power to destroy civilization. The torch which was passed on that inauguration day in 1961 is now being passed on again to a generation not only born in this century, but a generation which will spend a major portion of its professional and business life in the next beyond the year 2000. Alvin Toffler, in his book, The Third Wave, writes that this is the final generation of an old civilization and the first generation of a new one. A civilization which will bring with it new family styles, changed ways of working and living and loving, a new economy, and new political conflicts. But I submit that if that new civilization is to be an improvement over the present one, we will need to resolve the 2 concerns which remain as unfinished business on the world's agenda: the attaining of a just and lasting peace and the creating of a more just and sustainable world order. Perhaps one difference between your generation and mine is the growing realization that those 2 concerns are inseparable. The overriding fact is that today, no longer where we live, we are part of a global society in which there is no longer any such thing as a separate and isolated concern. A global society in which there is a minority of haves and a majority of people who are the have-nots. But the fact is that whether we like it or not, either we will all survive together in this world or none of us will. Either we will all share in the world's bounty or none of us will. We're all in this together. We may not like to admit that fact, but I am so aware of it when I am in El Salvador, in the refugee camps, as I have been recently, and in places like Warsaw, just before the imposition of martial law. Another difference between past times and present is the fact that the problems the world faces now are not the kind which can be remedied by a quick technological fix, the kind of fix we are so fond of, for they are problems rooted in global poverty and injustice, and they will be overcome only when they are dealt with on that level. Nor are they matters which can be resolved by methods which so often worked before. They require new and imaginative solutions, and most importantly, they require a recognition that the world no longer is, if it ever was, the way America might want it to be. I think Iran taught us that lesson. I sense a longing in this country as I go about for earlier days, when the world seemed to have been a more orderly place in which American power, especially military power, could preserve that order. And it's easy to understand why there is that longing, for it appeared to be a much safer time. But the world has become pluralistic, and our approach to the people and the nations of the world must take cognizance of that reality. To indulge ourselves in nostalgic fantasies is bound to lead us to simplistic solutions, which in today's pluralistic world is the road to disaster. It's a dangerous fallacy to try to apply methods that worked in the past to very different problems of today, military solutions, for example, to non-military problems, whether it be in El Salvador, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, or Poland. We need to consider what the real threats to peace are in the world today and concentrate on trying to find ways to alleviate them. For a long time, national security has been acquainted with military security, the belief that peace can be maintained by weapons of war. The simple fact is that is no longer true. In the last 2 decades of this century, and I believe far into the next, military security will be but one facet of national and global survival. The non-military threats to global and national security are manifold. The most unsettling and explosive force in the world at the present time is the unfulfilled expectations of the millions who have not, who are unable to attain a decent standard of living for themselves and for their children. And both in this country and overseas, it is those unrealized hopes for a better life that are the greatest threats to a lasting peace. No weapon or military alliance, no matter how strong, can alleviate hunger and poverty. No instrument of war, no matter how powerful, can overcome the disease, the malnutrition, and the human frustration that today threaten that peace. American military power is essential to maintaining global military balance. There is no debate on that issue. Our defense forces must be modernized to help maintain the peace, and they will be. But genuine peace, the kind that makes for a life on earth worth living, the kind that enables people and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for themselves and their children, will never be realized through massive military expenditures. I've often been struck by the fact that it was 2 of the outstanding military leaders of the Second World War who recognized and understood that fact, who understood the relationship between military expenditures, maintaining world peace, and meeting human need. It was General Eisenhower who said, "Every gun made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed." And George Catlett Marshall, a military man who became an outstanding Secretary of State, in a commencement address at Harvard, introduced his plan to rescue Europe with these words: "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." And his plan was backed up by the equivalent of $44 billion in today's U.S. currency. It brought Europe prosperity and hope. It meant growth and leadership to the United States, and it brought peace to a world tired of war. Today, the combined economies of North America, Western Europe, and Japan produce that $44 billion worth of goods and services in just over 2 days. And that amounts to less than 1/10 of what the world will spend for military purposes this year alone. Each and every day, $1.5 billion in this world is spent on weapons and military systems. The Brandt Commission report, entitled North-South, A Program for Survival, a report, by the way, which was on the bestseller lists in Europe and in Great Britain, and virtually unknown in this country, despite the fact that 2 distinguished Americans, including Katharine Graham, owner of the Washington Post, were on that commission, pointed out that in terms of the amount of money being spent to support militarism, the worldwide expenditure of only one half day would suffice to finance the entire malaria eradication program of the World Health Organization, and less than one half-day expenditure would be needed to conquer river blindness, which is still the scourge of millions that I see in Africa. For the price of one modern tank, 1,000 classrooms could be provided for 30,000 children in developing countries, while for the cost of one modern jet fighter, 40,000 village pharmacies could be established in poor countries. And when it comes to making friends, when it comes to making peace, when it comes to establishing a decent standard of living for all people, those classrooms and those pharmacies would have a much better return on their investment than tanks and jet aircraft ever could. It's not enough, you see, to increase our military might. We must also use our global resources to meet human need. The unfinished desires of people, unfulfilled desires of people to attain a decent standard of living and the pursuit of economic betterment cannot and will not be long repressed. We know from our own national experience that the drive for a better life, for human freedom, has tremendous force, it is universal, and it is irresistible. And of all the judgments of God and history we should fear most, it is their judgment on the world's continued failure to use the means at hand to end the hunger and poverty of the world. And that judgment will be even more harsh, precisely because we use those means at hand to produce weapons of war and destruction. You see, it's not just people overseas who are being affected by these major increases in military spending, while programs that meet human need are being slashed. It's the people of this country, especially those who live in rural poverty, the homeless of our cities, the abandoned, the alienated, the hurt, the disabled, the despairing, the minorities, and so help us the elderly. Resources that previously contributed, however inadequately, to efforts to improve the quality of life are now being diverted to produce more weapons of destruction, increasing international tensions, and accelerating a worldwide arms race. A report issued only yesterday morning said that this year, $20 billion worth of arms and weapon systems will be sold to third world countries. $20 billion, up from $9 billion only a decade ago. And the two largest sellers in this wild arms race are the Soviet Union and the United States. The vast amount of money we are spending on armaments is not producing an increase in global security, but is rather contributing to growing insecurity, instability, and tension in a world in which 1/3 of the people are overfed and overarmed, while 2/3 scratch out a mere subsistence, often short of necessary food, clothing, housing, health care, and education. And one only needs see people, as I do, in refugee camps, in El Salvador, in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, in Pakistan, hungry children, women dried up with no milk to feed their babies, or see the increasing number of homeless and abandoned men and women on the streets of American cities, to be aware that guns or butter means most basically death or life to millions of people. And it is time we put our hearts, our imaginations, and our money to finding solutions to these age-old problems. The making of peace and the meeting of basic human needs are two sides of the same coin, and that is the unfinished business that we must be about. To borrow from John Kennedy again, It is the fate of your generation to live with a struggle you did not start in a world you did not make. But the pressures of life are not always distributed by choice. There have been few times in history when those words were more true. The world you are entering and inheriting is a far cry from the traditional American dream. Recent polls show that the 80s are the first decade that we have ever entered as a people which we did not expect to be better at the end than at the beginning. The next few years will see us enter a major period of transition from a time of rapid growth and expanding affluence to a time of greater scarcities and having to live within limits imposed by mounting shortages of resources on which we have become dependent. And I believe we have in this time of transition the opportunity to choose which direction we will take as a nation. We can attempt to maintain our current lifestyles at all costs, try to recapture the good old days, draw ourselves up into a defensive posture, spend more and more on military hardware, and simply struggle to protect and maintain what we're pleased to call our way of life. And for many, that's an attractive option. For many, that is the only option. But I believe that to choose that direction is to follow the road toward increasing isolation and international tensions. The making of lasting peace and the meeting of basic human needs will not be achieved by following that road. Or we can seize this opportunity to discover a new dimension to the American dream, one that could move us beyond narrow personal and national interests into creating an alternative international future in which peace and global security are possible. A future in which America would be known throughout the world for its compassion, its deep desire for peace and justice, its commitment to human rights and human decency, sharing its life and its treasure with all the peoples of Earth. For a generation entering the job market in the time of rising unemployment and increasing competition for those jobs, when growing numbers of young people will be unable to afford for many years to buy a home, when post-secondary education in many places is in danger of moving beyond the financial reach of many families, and healthcare costs are skyrocketing, to choose to go in this second direction will not be an easy decision. But it is the direction, I believe, which holds out the only realistic hope for saving human society from eventual disaster. It means, in the first place, accepting the reality of growing scarcity. It means examining our own lifestyles, refusing to be captives any longer of a throwaway society, finding ways to conserve valuable resources, and coming to a recognition that it is possible to live the good life on a much more simple scale than most of us do now. Standard of living and quality of life are not the same thing at all. But simple living is not enough. Simplifying lifestyles and taking on economic and political issues are inseparable. I have become convinced over the years that it is almost impossible to be a thinking, functioning human being in a complex society without being involved in political action. Not the old politics of party or right or left, but issue politics, citizen movement politics, public interest group politics like Common Cause and Bread for the World, corporate stockholder proxy politics over energy use and environmental issues, over the use of public lands and the development of nuclear weapon systems. Political action that challenges and calls to account those enormous private interest groups that tend to maintain the status quo, that want to use their capital to shape the future as they want it to be. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of young people around the world are today struggling with this personal and social agenda by rethinking their life goals, their jobs, the functioning of local, state, and national organizations. They are creating alternative institutions and lifestyles rather than remaining enslaved to the old mass consumption, planned obsolescence, bigger is better, throwaway society, which has controlled and directed our lives for so very long, and which has accustomed us to having far more than our fair share of this fragile planet's limited and non-renewable resources. Those young people, and many not so young, are the hope of the future. And I invite you, graduates, I urge you to join with them in what may be the most important people's movement in human history. A movement which, if successful, could make possible lasting peace, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. A movement which could conserve sufficient of this earth's finite resources that all people could find new hope for a better and a more fulfilling life. When that torch is passed on once again to that generation not yet born, to that generation of which your children will be a part, the direction that we decide to take right now will determine if we have begun to see the transformation of this planet into a global civilization where war is no more, where the benefits of life are shared more equitably among all people, and there has been established the basis for a caring world community that today we can only dream about. You can help make that kind of a world a reality. Thank you for having me.
You have indeed challenged us, Reverend Stenning, not only those who graduate, but all of us who are part of this academic community. We thank you for the challenge, and we assure you of our best efforts to rise to meet it.